to all of you and welcome to the panel discussion on the SEBI consultation paper reviewing regulatory provisions related to independent directors on the boards of listed entities. This discussion is being organized by the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship, and our distinguished panelists today are Mr. M.K. Sharma, who is currently the chairman of Diageo, and he was on the board of directors of Unilever for 12 years, including 7 years as vice chairman of Diageo. He is the founder of M.K. Sharma and Associates. We have with us Mr. Ajay Nanavati, retired chairman of Syndicate Bank, managing director earlier of 3M, chairman Qantas Advisors, and he has been a huge supporter of the activities of the Center for Corporate Governance. And Mr. Samir Kumar, managing director, Inventus Capital, and he has served on numerous boards of startups, and he has helped these early stage firms to develop several profitable exits whenever he has served on their boards. And esteemed members of the CCGC advisory committee and colleagues, the SEBI consultation paper that reviews regulatory provisions related to independent directors is a serious attempt, as all of us know, to strengthen the board membership comprising of many different types of people, with each independent director to be chosen with regard to the specific attributes, experience, and expertise he or she offers that must match what the company needs at a particular point of time. So the SEBI paper proposes changes to be made in governance to help boards fulfill and demonstrate their fulfillment of their responsibilities to shareholders, including their duty of good faith. All directors are expected to act as if there is a single absentee owner and do everything reasonably possible to advance that owner's long-term interests. And therefore, the independent director is in a situation of watching the watchman, because the apex body, which is the corporate board, actually has the fundamental duty of overseeing value creation and value appropriation. And the independent directors are there to monitor the quality of care for other people's money, that of the shareholders and other stakeholders, and their major responsibility is to them. That responsibility of independent directors is most complex, and its exercise requires serious balancing for independent directors to learn about the business but not run it, nurture and reward management but replace it only when it is necessary, listen very carefully to and respect management proposals but question management's premises and factual support so as to distinguish management's self-interest from the corporate good. Independent directors are also expected to certify strategic plans from management, but also are expected to propose alternatives and participate in new strategy development. Above all, we as independent directors are expected to act in a collegial manner, but also in an adversarial manner when necessary, being willing to compromise when it is legitimate to do so, and not engage in witch hunting, but sufficiently anticipate trouble so as to self-correct before the regulators get there. We are now soliciting your informed comments and views on the proposals pertaining to the definition of independent directors, appointment and reappointment of independent directors, removal of independent directors, enhancing and bringing more transparency in the role of NRC nominations, that is the nominations and the remunerations committee, and prior approval of shareholders for appointment of independent directors, and the composition of the audit committee and the review of remuneration. May I now request Mr. M.K. Sharma to offer his valuable comments.
So some level of documentation and preparation of those names is far better than to try and get into a search process at that point in time. But external consultation with the like of Egon Zender and others to identify the right talent, because even today, I would say 90% plus of the organizations still go by informal networks and informal referrals to decide on independent directors. That's not necessarily a very healthy thing to happen. Again, on the question of prior approval of the board for appointment of prior approval of shareholders, I see some operational difficulties. I think there is an element of cost involved of convening a meeting or versus the likely benefits that we are going to drive. In the main report, the consultation paper, there are references to saying in some cases, independents have been voted out. I would submit that there would be more an exception if they constitute even 1% or 0.1% of the total number of cases of reappointment of independent directors. That exception only proves the rule that generally speaking, the voting on these matters, unless somebody sought to be appointed who has a notoriety about his lack of independence or lack of probity in conduct, by and large, independent directors are. And if that's a procedure allowed under the Companies Act to appoint additional director, go back and seek shareholders' mandate at the AGM, and particularly the appointment is for a period of 5 years at a time, which is what the law permits. I think to be worried about saying somebody could, theoretically speaking, remain in office without shareholders' vote for 9 months, I think is something which probably we are overemphasizing then the resultant benefit that we are. So convening an EGM to have the director's appointment voted upon, to my mind, is something which is not necessarily the, as a concept, it seems very progressive. But in terms of practicality and balancing the benefits versus the attendant costs and complexities, I would submit at this point in time, it may be better to allow appointment as additional directors and to get confirmation from the shareholders at the AGM to be a more pragmatic approach at this point in time. Last one, I think the one on saying if an independent director resigns, he has to give full reasons, fully endorse that, no reservations whatsoever, and this whole personal reasons, other preoccupations, those are all, I think, very clearly euphemisms which are used by people to get off a board, which they're uncomfortable about. But to put an embargo of, let's say, you can't get appointed as an independent director in another company if you have resigned on these reasons, I think making the resignation letter public in toto, making the director spell out any reservations or concerns which he may have had, and probably a provision saying if he hasn't said so, he would be debarred at a later stage if some wrongdoing is discovered to say, I left because of this. I think that may be a far better proposition to make the independent director speak up rather than putting an embargo on his joining another board for 1 year. And lastly, I think there are many other things. For example, I was reflecting, I may decide to quit a board because I find that the directors and officers' insurance in that company is grossly inadequate given the kind of exposure that they have. Okay. And if I leave on that reason, I will call it a personal reason because, or the deductibles. For example, in another company, I was looking at the deductibles. First, 5 lakh rupees cost of defending yourself has to be borne by the director concerned. The officer's liability comes in only after that level. Now, it may be a good enough reason for a middle-class independent director to say, I'm not willing to accept that kind of a DNA policy for my defense, and I would really want no deductibles. If I get sued for discharge of my official duties, the policy should cover, or there should be an indemnity at least from the company to say up to that value, you will be indemnified by the company, if not by the insurance company. So there could be many reasons where somebody leaves, or irreconcilable differences in terms of style. I have known some resignations not because there was a financial impropriety, but because the mannerism of some of the promoter directors was such that people felt let down and being looked down upon by the promoter families. Now, that would not be something which should be, if there is a lack of chemistry or lack of mutual respect, and you decide to leave, to say you are then debarred from, and these would constitute personal reasons. What may seem to me to be an insult and lack of courtesy, somebody else may say it's fine. So from that perspective, I would say that this 1 year cooling off period before accepting another appointment is, in my view, adding an unnecessary complexity. We must really strengthen the framework where people have to spell out the reasons. And if they haven't spelled out, they being debarred from raising a fresh plea at a later stage should the circumstances arise where they need to say why I actually left was not what I stated in my resignation letter. I was worried about this fraud. I was worried about this related party transaction, or I was worried about this. So that prohibition, or saying you would be not allowed to agitate those matters or spell out additional grounds if you have not done it in your disclosure to the stock exchanges, may be a much better mechanism than putting a 1 year cooling off period. Composition of Audit Committee, fully support, no issues at all. And similarly, I think on remuneration, speaking for myself, I may be in a minority. I'm not in favor of independent directors taking ESOPs. I feel it is much better to reward them with commission on profits, which are regulated by the Companies Act, and there's a limit prescribed. And the only area where I think we have need for improvement is the over and above the Companies Act, there are a number of sector regulators who are putting incremental limitations on that model. And having been a former non-executive chairman of ICICI Bank and having served on their board as an independent director, in fact, in the first 8-year term that I served on the ICICI Bank's board, barring sitting fees of 20,000 rupees per meeting, there was no other remuneration whatsoever. By the time I became the non-executive chairman, the independent directors were allowed 10 lakh rupees per annum. But the kind of time and effort they spent, given the regulatory framework and the obligations that the independent directors had, whether it was risk committee, audit committee, credit committee. And so I felt that regulators were on the one hand wanting them to be accountable and equally wanting to be extremely stingy in terms of rewarding them by way of commission. So I think the Company Act lays down a fairly good rule, and sector regulators should resist the temptation to put sub-limits within that. But I don't think we as a society or a business community are yet ready for directors being remunerated through ESOPs. So I would stop at that, sir. We'll be happy to take any questions and again respond as and when my other valued colleagues offer their comments.
Thank you so much, sir. Your valued comments were so insightful, and it had loads of experience and understanding of what's happening in this arena. I would now request Mr. Ajay Nanavati to give his informed comments. Mr. Ajay Nanavati.
Thank you. Sharma is a tough act to follow. So besides just nodding my head to everything that he was saying, it's going to be difficult to sort of add to that. But, I think I will just sort of share a few broad perspectives. I think the dilemma that we face here is the fact that we tend to treat this independent director situation as a one-size-fits-all. I have been involved in an MNC as a chairman of a public sector bank, on the board of a public family-owned public company, on a pre-IPO company. So, I think one of the biggest dilemmas that we have is there's a tendency to believe that an independent director on an MNC like 3M, for example, or an independent director on a public sector bank like Syndicate, for example, or on a family-run, that we tend to have a sort of a broad brush definition. So I guess it really comes back to the fact that in some ways, irrespective of which kind of entity you're associated, especially in the Indian context where it tends to be largely promoter driven, most of the large corporates. But I think we have to recognize that irrespective of whether you're on an MNC public board or on a government board or on a family owned board, the role of independent director in many ways should not change. But in reality, that's not the case. And I can say this from my Syndicate Bank experience, for example, vis-a-vis my 3M experience. To say that an independent director on Syndicate Bank was in any way or form the same as an independent director on, say, 3M India, for example, would be just kidding ourselves. So I think to start with, we don't have the definitional aspect, though theoretically should be uniform. We all understand what the roles of the independent director are. So I don't think there is any ambiguity of what is expected of them. But the question is that do they actually have the ability to deliver on those expectations, depending on the nature of the entity you're associated with. So having said that, I think certainly even a 3-year number, for example, on a cooling period, in some ways it's a number pulled from the air. Is there any sort of sanctity to 3? Is 2 any more different than 3, or is 3 any more different than 4? It's a number. And as Shamaji correctly pointed out, to expect that whether by moving the dial from 2 to 3, you've actually changed the dynamics is kind of, fool's paradise, so to speak. So again, I think that's a tough one to say that is 3 going to be, 3 is obviously better than 2, but is it optimal? I think there's a lot to be said to that. The question of appointment and reappointment, this one is something near and dear to my heart. And I think one of the dilemmas that we have had in the Indian ecosystem, and again, I compare this to the other countries that I've been associated. I'm on the board of a Swiss company, I was on the board of an Israeli company, et cetera, et cetera. And I know it's unfair to sort of draw those parallels. But I think it really starts with that induction. And I think that determines, the filters that go in at that stage impact everything else down the road. So I think that level of due diligence upfront is very rarely done. To begin with, the pool is fairly limited here. And I'm not convinced that there is adequate amount of due diligence done at the sort of the identification phase in terms of, we tend to have, and pardon me for saying this, again, in the spirit of candor and on this forum, we get overwhelmed by brands. There is a tendency, especially on boards, that how dare a mere mortal like me question Mr. X or Mr. Y, who is we have this rock star culture out here where we believe that by bringing on a branded entity, you have by default sort of negated any concern. And we know for a fact in all the cases where we've seen recently that you've had hugely branded entities which have in no way stopped some of the things that we've seen happening. So I have a strong view on how we identify, bring on board, you referenced Egon Zehnder. I was talking to Vinita Bali the other day when she got on the board of Smith and Nephew in the UK. She was telling me, Ajay, you can't believe it was a 6-month process. I had to be vetted by everybody. They went through a grueling selection process. And I have not seen this once happening in India. You call and say, you where? Can you please come on? Would you be interested? This old boy network, you scratch my back, I scratch my back, which feeds into all the remuneration aspects, all the resignation aspects, all that really starts from there. That's the sort of the core point. If you bring in, again, I don't mean to be facetious or cavalier about it, but as they say in the IT industry, garbage in, garbage out. I know that's an unfair comment to make, but I really feel that that's an area where we really need to, and this is not a regulatory aspect, it's really something that we need to really drive home, that aspect of induction and how we appoint. And this ties back in some ways to and I on this front, I kind of disagree with Sharmaji on terms of the diversity aspect. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about gender diversity. I'm talking about diversity of skill sets. On most of the boards I tend to be on, I'm either surrounded by lawyers or chartered accountants. 90% of the boards are either a lawyer or a chartered accountant. I'm an outlier as a guy who's just an engineer. So and that too from an industrial manufacturing space. So I think that area of board diversity, and I use diversity again, not in the context of gender, but in the area of skill set. And that the point you made about cybersecurity is an absolutely valid point, because very few of us from our generation are as savvy on that front as. But I don't need to be an expert on. I don't expect all of us to be experts on everything. I think we have to complement each other. Rather than expect us to be masters, jack of all trades, and so I don't think I have that expectation. But I certainly feel that we need far more board diversity in this country than I've seen on my own board in 3M in the parent company. I mean, and whenever I give my talks, I put up that screenshot of the profile of the board of my parent company. Now, again, we can say that, listen, you can't compare 3M in the US to India, and that point is well taken. We're not comparing necessarily apples to apples, but I think there are learnings from that we can actually take consensus of. When it comes to removal of directors, independent directors, now, for example, just tomorrow we have our annual independent directors meeting where we vet the management, we vet the chairman, which is again done in a very sort of a friendly sort of a way. But one of the things that I do, at least the boards that I was chairman on, I really made it a point to actually capture those takeaways in a documented form. So there is a paper trail. I think I remember when I was in Syndicate Bank, we used to get pulled up by the Reserve Bank because they assumed that your board minutes did not capture the deliberations that took place in the board. They actually used to slap our wrist on that front. And I can see Sharmaji smiling out there. But
you are not alone. the regulator told that to every single bank.
Exactly. So I was very, very diligent about ensuring that even the dissent was adequately captured. I think we do not do enough of a justice in terms of recording our board deliberations as robustly as we should. I think that if one were to go through that, you would see red flags very early on. If they were truly captured, we used to have this dashboard, red, yellow, green, and I always said if it's a yellow, it's waiting to become red. A yellow is waiting to become red. So this kind of dashboard approach. So I really feel that capturing board, how we minute these things should be adequately captured. So there's less arbitrariness and ad hocism that creeps in. At least there is a defense mechanism that, if you felt this, why didn't you say so? Why 3 years later do you tell me that I'm not competent? Why did you wait for 3 years to capture my incompetence? If there was this thing, it should have been appropriately captured. But again, it's not in our DNA to be contentious or encourage dissent. And I think that's a key role for a chairman, is to create a climate that allows for healthy dissent. Dissent is not disloyalty. We too often assume dissent to be disloyalty, and that is not the case. I mean, this applies even in running a company. If the MD and his EDs or his top management. So this is not only at a board level. So I think that comes back to that. Transparency, the role of NRC. I mean, I could not agree more. As I said, in every board that I'm associate, obviously the audit committee is right up there. In fact, there was a situation where audit committee members got reimbursed significantly higher than NRC committee members. Till our ex-chairman of, he actually corrected that. He said that this is not correct, that why should an audit committee member be compensated differently from an NRC director? So I think that we are absolutely critical that the NRC gets a bigger seat at the table than it has historically. So I think that point about bringing in more focus on the role of the NRC is absolutely essential. Prior approval of shareholders for appointment of IDs. I completely concur with Sharmaji's comments about, in the Indian context, to have minority shareholders and expect them to speak up in a meaningful enough voice to influence an outcome is probably expecting too much. I like that suggestion that he made about using some of the institutional investor community as a much more knowledgeable bouncing board. Not to say that the minority shareholders are idiots, but clearly, as you said, it lends itself to all kinds of potential green mail, as you called it, which I completely concur with. So on that point, I couldn't agree more on this. Resignation of independent directors. Now, this one also, in many presentations, I recently gave a talk in Goa at the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs on this very subject. And we've got a lot of statistical data which shows that very, very, very rarely would an independent director have the gumption to speak up and candidly voice his concerns. And I think we really need to make this, you should not be allowed to get away with this sort of motherhood and apple pie, generic, soft touch expectations. Either you have a regulation which is robust or don't have the regulation. To have a regulation and then allow this out clause, I think just meets the purpose to allow that to happen. Composition of audit committee, completely concur. Again, unfortunately, a lot of the failures that we have seen, at whose step, I mean, we kind of expect the audit committee to be like God, and I think in many ways it's kind of unfair that the onus that we put on them, because at the end of the day, they only know what they know. They don't know what they don't know. So in that sense, there is only that much you can put the onus on them for. But I do believe that in general, my exposure to companies that I've been associated with is the audit committees tend to do a fairly thorough, I mean, I've seen most of them tend to be very diligent, ask the right questions. So despite some of the failures that have been attributed to lack of diligence by the audit committee, my personal experience has been fairly good. Again, given the fact that they can only comment on what presented to them. So if there is stuff that is not, they can ask some questions, some probing questions. But if there is intention, and this is where I love my friend from Tata Chemicals, where he makes that analogy of Niti versus Niyat. That's a phrase that I use extensively about Niti versus Niyat. So I think that captures that quite well. As far as remuneration, I actually, again, disagree, Sharmaji, respectfully with you on the issue about restricted options. I think one of the things that we do need to encourage boards from doing is taking a longer term view. I think we tend to, and the one way to drive longer term thinking and behavior is to incentivize I think right now the reward systems tend to be very aligned with very short term objectives. And that leads to short term thinking and short term solutions. So in that sense, I think offering these incentives will in some ways, hopefully, drive a little bit more longer term view rather than a short term perspective. So I think those are broadly my thoughts, more philosophical than regulatory in that sense. Again, I will leave it at that and look forward to setting any dialogue or comments post that.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Ajay Nanavati. You always bring in a complete whiff of fresh air and perspective on some of these issues, and I have had the opportunity to listen to your thoughts earlier. Thank you so very much. May I now request Mr. Samir Kumar to share his perspectives?
Sure. So, I've had two rock stars, to use Ajay's words, before me, who've had such experience on large public boards that, I'm a little hesitant to air my views, but having been an investor who sort of speaks his mind, I am going to air them. Where I agree with both of them, I'll just say yes, and move on. But I do have two areas where I've, strong disagreements with what was mentioned earlier. So on the first point, I think KMPs, I'm with Mr. Sharma and Ajay. In fact, my view was a KMP or an employee should never be allowed to be an independent director in that promoter group company. No cooling off period in my mind will work. For relatives, it's okay to have a cooling off period. If my relative worked in some firm, then maybe after a cooling off period, I could be independent in that firm. But for an employee in KMP, absolutely not, was my view. I also had a different view on, I read that the term of an independent director is up to 5 years. Now, if it is a set term of 5 years, then I think there is no issue. But if it's not a set term of 5 years, then I feel a term should be set and he should not be removed before that term expires. Because the threat of removal, to my mind, compromises independence. So that is my view, that if there isn't a set term, there must be a set term. And I had a different point of view from Mr. Sharma on the minority shareholders. In fact, my notes were that only minority shareholders should vote, not even promoters, on adding independent directors, because to my mind, you're seeking independence from the promoter. Who are you seeking independence from? Not from the retail or the minority or the institutional investor. And if the promoter is the guy appointing the independent director, I don't see how independence can happen. But I see the point that Mr. Sharma made. And my only hope is that if minority shareholders are called upon to vote, number one, the whole online mechanism should make things simpler. We've seen a whole host of them in the last 1 year. And secondly, we could institute a negative mechanism. So if only 2% of the minority shareholders attend, then maybe the mechanism is, if I want to protest against someone's independence, or I feel he's not independent enough, I need 51% of people to take my stand as an individual retail investor. So that's my view on removal. On 4.4, I was fine. 4.5, I had the same view. The prior view I felt of minority shareholders, a quick view should be taken. And I'm not for appointing a director immediately after an AGM and allowing him to continue for a year. On 4.6, the resignation process also, I was okay with the proposals. I just felt that cooling off period for 1 year may be too much if I resign for personal reasons. I may have had genuine personal reasons to, let's say my parents were unwell and I had to look after them, and so I couldn't devote time. But 6 months later, my circumstances could change, and therefore I felt the cooling period could be shortened. on points like D&O policy and all, I feel they're not personal reasons. They're genuine reasons that I should cite and quit. And the independence is maintained when I speak out my mind. If I don't speak out my mind, if I don't have chemistry with the promoter and I say I'm resigning because I'm preoccupied, I don't think that's right. 4.7, I had no issues. And 4.8 on compensation, I actually agree totally with Mr. Nanavati. My view was that compensation and independence are inversely related. If I'm compensated more, I'm less independent. However, I understand that you have to compensate people for the time they spend and so on. And there's no better way. Ultimately, I'm there as an independent in a company to take care of shareholder interests. The only subjective measure of shareholder interest that I've taken care of is the share value increase I've created. That is best captured in a share price, ESOPs, and so on. In fact, I had noted that profit-linked commissions should be eliminated. They drive extreme short-term thinking. If I'm an independent for 2 years, I will encourage short-term decisions such that profit in those 2 years is maximized, fifth year be damned. So I had minimal sitting fees, no profit-linked commissions, and strong encouragement for ESOPs. Those were my points.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Samir Kumar. We also have with us Professor Anil Suraj, who is part of our advisory committee. Professor Anil Suraj, do you have any comments?
I think I'm very happy listening because there are wonderful issues coming out, and I'm sorry to have joined late. It is my misfortune to have missed out. We had an institute meeting on an urgent basis, but I think I'll wait to hear more, Professor.
Okay. So here is a question, Mr. Sharma. Given your very considered view and very long innings and
just hang on. I think
no, I'll just come. I'm coming. Just gone to the washroom.
Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you for flagging that. Mr. Sharma, I actually had a question on the similar topic as Mr. Samir Kumar was just mentioning and Mr. Nanavati was. And given your years of experience and this deep insight into the working and the machinations which go around in the governance process, here is my thought process, and I would love to hear your analysis and your reasons for suggesting whatever you're suggesting. So my thinking goes this way, that independent directors are there on the boards to examine the executive initiatives, whether they are in the best interest of the business. So unless an independent director becomes a shareholder, he actually does not have any skin in the game. So provided, of course, there are restrictions on the resale of that during the term in office. You can't do that. My extreme view, this is a very extreme view, and I want you to really tell me why this will not work. That no other compensation must be paid except for having ESOPs. And the idea here being that they must really get aligned to what will create value within the company. And they've got to monitor management in the best interests of corporate productivity. They've got to also counteract the oversight inhibiting environment. And if it is cash-based and benefit-based laden fees, then why would an independent director, given the paucity of time and attention, actually think very hard about what is happening to the company? I want your views and thoughts, sir.
First and foremost, I think, ultimately, the question is what the stakeholders want. Okay. At this point in time, let's say the hub of the corporate actions, America, there's always this whole issue of quarter to quarter. The CEO gets sacked if he doesn't deliver on the goals for this second quarter. So he is given indulgence in one quarter, second quarter is out. Okay.
Correct.
And that's the measurement that you are putting in place.
Right.
Now, you can't really have independent directors thinking of a 5 or 7 year perspective or long-term growth when the executive management is being measured on quarter to quarter basis. I think there need to be a certain level of alignment.
Correct.
So that's the first position that I would have. I'm personally speaking not in favor of quarterly results. Speaking of myself, I was very happy with half-yearly and full-year results. I think they provided certain level of freedom, flexibility, and to take the right decisions. Today, I think the quarter-to-quarter results are a bit of a burden, both on the independents as also on the executive management. Second, I think there is a halfway house possible, and I'll give you a number of international companies are practicing. There could be a mandate that commission that you earn, 50% of it or 60% of it, you need to necessarily buy the stock of the company.
Okay.
And hold it for 3-year period. Okay. Right. So that brings in a certain level of alignment. You are obligated, you earn commission, but you are obligated to reinvest a predominant part of it. In fact, very often, if you agree to reinvest in the shares, the commission can be a slightly higher figure, because if it is 100, it can be made 125 if you have actually committed to reinvest certain part of your commission into the stock of the company. Third, I think in India, that's a predominant problem. And that's a problem also in SMEs in Europe. Control is a very critical part of the psyche of the promoters. ESOPs lead to dilution. If you have to actually go and cover the ESOPs by a trust mechanism in the marketplace, then it is not efficient at all. You see, one of the beauties of ESOPs is that it is market pays for the rewards, company doesn't have to pay it. Or company pays very moderately for it, it's actually the market which pays for it. Now, if you have to cover, and my experience has been that more than 50% of the corporates, given the level of shareholding of promoter groups, and the fact it is now second generation, third generation, and therefore promoter families themselves are getting somewhat atomized, there is a desire to do even the ESOPs for executives, leave alone the independent directors, through the trust mechanism of buying from the open market rather than expanding the capital base. And there two things happen as a result of it. One, very often, you would then say, let's issue fewer shares, but at a huge discount to the market price. Okay. So that the people are compensated in terms of the discount that they earn rather than the value creation that occurs. So I think the phenomenon of control and dilution of promoter control is something we can't wish away. And that's, to my mind, a bigger reason why ESOPs, in fact, in many companies, you struggle to bring in ESOP even for executives, where I think it is critical. Independence, I think, to my mind, is a second aspect. But even there, if it is being done through a trust mechanism rather than through a primary issuance of stock options, I think it loses its, in terms of the cost benefit for the organization. And you might as well leave then the directors to choose how much they want to invest. You could really have a minimum threshold saying, thou will invest so much in the stock of the company out of the commission that you earn. So that's my position, sir.
Thank you so very much. There is another a question that I have for all of you on the esteemed panel. That for a very long time, audit committee has always had the preponderance in terms of importance and significance. The time has come for the NRC to have a equally significant proposition to offer to the board. Primarily, the NRC must have the main onus the main responsibility and accountability for proposing, in other words, identifying, proposing new independent directors, and it is for the board to approve, and finally the shareholders can ratify. It can't be the other way around. So what are your views, sir? All of you on the panel.
So if I can come in, couldn't agree more with you on that. The reason for the historical difference between AuditCom and the Norm and RemCom, or the governance com as it was referred to in many companies, is primarily to do with AuditCom. The terms of reference are so well articulated that I think they stand out, saying, this is what we are banking on, this set of these people. And I think the difference between the AuditCom of a very good AuditCom or very well-run company versus not so well-run company, the mandate would not be very different. NRCs, on the other hand, have thus far been not as empowered as they ought to be. And that's one of the reasons, I think. NRCs primarily were looking at appraisal of the senior management in terms of their KPIs versus their performance, reviewing the independent directors' appointments or shortlisting candidates. But I think in terms of appraisal of non-executive promoter directors, for example, NRCs rarely played a role in many organizations. Promoters actually resisted that and said it is only for, I think, as I remember, one of the famous industrialists saying about FICCI and ASSOCHAM, saying one was run by Karmacharis and the other was run by the Punjipatis. So the question was that people who own the businesses could not be appraised by professionals, right. And appraisal was only required for professionals. So I think the mandate for NRC is evolving. I would say audit committee mandate has evolved far more strongly over a period of time. I couldn't agree more that there's need for parity between NRC and AuditCom, but we need to actually then make that NRC mandate more stronger, more specific, and more meaningful.
Yes. In other words, it has always functioned as an RC, never an NRC.
No, so if I may add to Sharmaji's comments on NRC.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
As I said, that is a subject near and dear to my heart. I think the point you make is absolutely bang on. You know, there is a perception that the NRC charter is sort of loosey-goosey. It's sort of very subjective and very sort of soft and loose rather than sort of a well-defined. So I think that can easily be addressed. The point is I agree with you that for it to get a true seat at the table, there has to be a very well-defined definition of roles and responsibilities within that. But I don't believe that should end up being the showstopper in the sense that is relatively, it just takes some effort, but it can be done. So that is unfortunately the case, but that should not end up becoming the justification for not having a proper seat at the table. I mean, I remember, when I looked at some of the LinkedIn profiles of people, and I see when they actually list their profession as independent director. It always blows my mind to see people's profiles actually listing independent director as their profession, So I thought that might bring a bit of a chuckle, so I just threw that in. All right, that's all I had to say.
Thank you so much.
I'll just respond to insofar as audit committee is concerned, I think you have accounting standards, you have statutory auditors, you have internal auditors. I think it is a lot more objective criteria, and there are materiality threshold well defined. So I think the scope for subjectivity in the context of AuditCom deliberations is significantly lower compared to the subjectivity that can come in or permeate into the deliberations of Norm-Rem committee. Exactly. And I think we need to really evolve mechanisms and strengthen. And therefore, I think the members of the NRC need to have a higher order character and higher order integrity to be able to do justice to that. They don't have the clutches of accounting standards and the auditors and the internal audit and materiality thresholds, which come in very handy to the audit com chair.
Exactly.
But not, so therefore we need to make sure that we evolve the NRC, and globally NRCs are considered to be numero uno. I think audit closely follows, but I think in the global governance framework, NRCs they are the ones who actually take the call saying CEO needs to go, or this person is fit enough or not fit enough to be there. So I think NRCs are very important, but I think in India it is still evolving, and we do strengthen that institution.
Exactly. Thank you so very much. Mr. Samir Kumar?
No, I have no competence to comment on this issue, and the two stalwarts have spoken. So, honestly, I don't have.
Okay, absolutely. Professor Anil, Suraj?
Yeah, no, I think I've already heard one of them saying lawyers should be kept away, but nonetheless, I think, but I think I agree with both of them that governance or even the kind of expectation that we have of NRC is very difficult to put down in terms of measurable or in some sense outcomes which are far more according to expectations. So which also means that perhaps we need to have a different kind of inputs to people who discharge these responsibilities. I think it is no longer sufficient to be able to do what is to be done, but to also articulate the process, the foolproof mechanism, as simple as they may be. I think it is, and it goes back to what I think Mr. Nanavati was mentioning. We need to document many of these things. I mean, it's important that NRC brings out these simple but required steps, and it will be a good input for us to engage with when we have training programs, capacity building initiatives, that we must focus on some of these things which are very, they look very simple outwardly, but require a far more thought and effort of diligence into making them happen. But that's my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Sir, the last point on which I would seek a reaction.
Sir, on the NRC, one more comment I would want to make.
Yes.
I think our governance standard thus far, we talk of board evaluation, committee evaluation, individual directors evaluation, and so on. And over time, it has evolved. But my grievance with the current system is that it is still numbers driven. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I personally believe that a board evaluation or a committee evaluation or director evaluation would be far more meaningful if it was to be put into text rather than numbers. What are the strengths of this person? What are the areas where he could improve, where he adds value, where he could do better? And I think a certain level of qualitative discussion and dialogue can make NRC a lot more effective. I think most companies today are still doing a quantitative rating system and saying your average is 3.9 or 4.2 out of 5. The group average is this. Therefore, you are slightly better than the mean, or you are slightly lagging behind the mean. And I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is really a very, very old method of doing. And we Indians are very, very polite. I think we never want to give anyone less than 3. But typically, it would be either a 4 or a 5. So it's I think even the measurement of how we deal with these issues is also requires some degree of rethinking.
Exactly. Thank you, sir. One last thing, sir, before we close. And this again is a very subjective view, that while we discuss independent directors, the prime independent director actually is a non-executive chairman. And I have a perspective on this, and I would like to be informed by all of you as to what do you think in terms of your own experience and your insight. That independent directors per se are just corporate outsiders. They have their own careers, they have their own responsibilities. Individually, they typically lack the time and resources needed to obtain the requisite inside knowledge to perform their significant monitoring role. one member of the board, independent of the CEO, must have the prime responsibility of and actually devote the necessary time to getting all these other independent directors well informed by helping them focus on issues that are important to the shareholders and to the stakeholders and on the risks facing the company. And therefore, the lead director, a concept which is deployed in other countries, not in ours, but in our case, at least we have the non-executive chairman, who in the true spirit is the captain of all independent directors. I mean, that's a perspective that I have. And in the true spirit of being the primero uno in terms of being the topmost independent director, the non-executive chairman is the one who coordinates, who integrates, who communicates, who molds the entire group of disparate individuals into a mutually supportive team working to foster management success. And there has to be a focus on the non-executive chairman if we are really thinking about leadership in the boardroom and delivering results in corporate governance. I would love to listen to your thoughts, sir, all of you.
If I could come in, sir, I think we need then one of the welcome changes that being recommended in the main report on which comments have not been sought is to do with, if we want a non-executive chairman, the first fear I have is then the independence would get reduced to 1/3 of the board composition. And promoters and their nominees would then get into a majority situation. And non-executive chairman is only primus inter pares. He doesn't really have any special powers apart from his leadership qualities. So between the independents constituting at least equal number in the board composition, to my mind, is more important from a governance point of view than having a non-executive chairman. I'm quite happy to leave the non-executive chairmanship to a promoter director and substitute the role that you have in mind with a lead independent director who steps in. But between 1/3 versus 50%, I would any day prefer 50% independent directors as a better model for governance than 1/3 constituting the independent board.
Okay, sir. Thank you so very much. Mr. Nanavati?
Yeah, so again, I have a slightly different view on this. I mean, I always use this analogy of the non-executive chairman being sort of the music conductor, and I think the role of a non-executive chairman is so critical because that's when we talk about setting the tone. I mean, I'll give you an example of myself when I took over in Syndicate as chairman, non-executive chairman. I was told, for example, on my appointment that I was not allowed to interface with the next level below EDs, at the GM levels. All my communication had to be filtered through the EDs or the MDs to the board. And I consciously made it a point to spend time with each and every one of the next level down, even though it was in direct contravention of a written diktat. And I remember having this conversation that, I think at the role of a non-executive chairman in terms of being able to solicit I think the cultural elements of a company, which we have not talked much about, the non-executive chairman play a key role in determining what the culture of the company is, in terms of being able to allow, again, us Indians in general, I think it's important that one of the things that non-chairman must do is to solicit inputs from, you tend to have in any board, you'll have 2 or 3 guys or gals who take up 80% of the conversation, and there'll always be 2 dominant directors. And I think one of the key roles of the chairman is to really solicit and bring out the views of the broader community. So I still feel that a non-executive chairman's role is absolutely crucial. But again, it varies from individual to individual. It's a very individually kind of a thing. But I think, like in American companies, for example, this would be like in my own company in 3M. Unlike the European companies in the UK, where the role is chairman and CEO is split, in many US companies, chairman and CEO is the same individual.
Right.
You'll see in most large American companies, it's chairman, president, and CEO. So I think, and there is a school of thought on the merits of that. But I'm a much more of a believer that segregation of the role and really having the chairman, non-executive chairman who has no vested interest, who should have no vested interest, and should be a neutral arbiter, and sort of set the tone at the top. I'm a huge supporter of having a empowered, effective, non-executive chairman playing a really crucial role in driving the board, in addition to driving the company, but driving the board, because he actually dictates the agenda. He dictates or he should dictate the agenda, and he determines what's captured in the board minutes. He determines the assignments to the different subcommittees. So I mean, it's a very, very meaningful role.
Exactly.
I wouldn't agree more with you. The only question I have is the Indian business environment ready today? From a situation where promoters were typically also the chief executives, apart from being the chairman of the boards, we are now hovering around to a point of view where most large-sized companies have accepted that the CEO and MD would typically be a professional manager, and the economic interests of the majority shareholder would be represented by the non-executive directors, and very often, and one of them acting as the non-executive chairman, because then they become the CEO is professional and non-executive chairman is a promoter. But ideally, if we can get into a model where the Indian promoters are willing to cede, and regulations can be modified to the extent of saying they would per se be investors and nothing more. At best, they can have one or two nominees on the board to represent their interests, but chairmanship and the CEOship of the organization would vest with professionals, nothing like it. But my sense, being rooted in realism, is we are probably a decade or a decade and a half away from that as of today.
Okay. Thank you so very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Samir Kumar?
Yeah, so actually, while I have heard Mr. M.K. Sharma, and I don't disagree strongly with him, but I have 2 points to make. I think we must have non-executive chairmen for all listed companies. And the non-executive chairman could be the lead independent that Mr. Sharma talked about. But he has to be the non-executive chairman because he must drive the rest of the governance. And coming from where I come from, I'm not so concerned about, I agree with Mr. Sharma that promoters are probably not ready for this. But I think if we don't drive this change today, we are not 10 years away, we are 50 years away from having this change. So we have to do it now. We have to do it in a manner where regulations drive it. We have to have executive chairman, and Mr. Sharma made a point that if you have a non-exec chairman, then 1/3 independent. Why can't we have a non-exec chairman and 50% independent?
I agree.
Why
I
can't
would
the
love
regulator
that.
say that?
No,
I think that's what we should
that.
drive regulation towards. We should drive regulation towards that, is my point.
The only other question, I think, a wider issue which I have is we must equally assess whether people would then, particularly I'm talking of the industrial families and promoters who do not need public money, would they want listing? I think there's a very fine balance between the obligations of listing and access to public money.
Yes.
And my sense is that today we are getting into a mode in our enthusiasm where a lot of promoters are saying, we wish we hadn't gone public.
Yes.
Many of them are talking in terms of, can we now take our company private?
Right.
Now, I think as professionals, we have an obligation to make sure that public listing is not merely an exit route for PE players.
Right.
There are promoters who are interested in saying, we would want to grow in size and scale, make public participate in our growth, have a stake in us, and there's a right balance that comes with public shareholding and the entrepreneurial skill of the promoter family. So I think it's a debatable question, and we need to really bear in mind this fine balance. If we ultimately, for example, I think related party, majority of minority is being driven now to an extent where people are saying, we having concentrated high risk and high exposure to this entity, a lay shareholder or retail shareholder can tomorrow, if he doesn't like me or doesn't like the performance of the company, he can vote with his feet and sell the shares and walk away. I don't have that luxury. So from that point of view, I think at some point in time as professionals, we need to assess for ourselves very cogently, are we striking the right balance? And I think encouraging people to access public markets, to my mind, is a bigger economic need, would have a meaningful role in terms of the development of the economy. If we start shunning access to public markets by promoter groups who are well established, I think we'll be doing a disservice as regulators.
I think that's a brilliant point you made, Mr. Sharma. And I don't know whether we have time, but if Professor Raghunath allows me a minute, I'll just give my point of view. It's a beautiful point that Mr. Sharma has made. Can I take a minute?
Sure, please.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes.
So I think, like I said, it's a lovely point you've made. But Mr. Sharma, things are changing. If you see the companies that have gone public in the last maybe 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and foresee what's going to go public in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, my own sense is that more of the companies that will access markets will be first generation entrepreneurs funded by venture capital or private equity and so on, who do not have quote unquote a promoter mindset, but have a very different mindset from the promoter mindset that at least I feel, I've not experienced it, but I feel exists. And therefore, I think a lot of these things, if we drive into regulation, there won't be a revolt against this, is my view, if you take a 5-10 year point of view. But you're right that existing promoter mindsets are what you've said.
This would work, sir, in the context of services companies, where somebody can start an enterprise with relatively more modest financial resources, show performance, and then get more capital from investor community, and then eventually give them an exit by a public listing. Where you have to put upfront money with a 5-year gestation project and stand guarantees and warranties to public financial institutions and banks, the mindset is slightly different, sir. And I think we need to really look at the different needs. The model that you talk about would work beautifully well in services sector, which are not capital intensive, where you can raise money as you perform and deliver to expectations and goals. But I think in manufacturing companies, particularly mining companies, metal companies, it would be a lot more challenging to really get into that model. Okay. You do need people to.
I get it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Professor Anil, Suraj.
No, once again, I think excellent points. In fact, in the recent decision of this Tata and the mystery case also, the court talks about something similar, trying to say that, well, at some level we should allow the flexibility for, the regulation should not be in some sense suffocative in this thing. We should allow them to work out. But yeah, the regulations cannot also be only reactions. They have to be predicting what would be the situation in the coming years and be able to act in advance. One other thing was that I think both, all three of them have mentioned about what are the efforts required for a so-called outsider, because at the end of the day, without mincing words, independent directors are outsiders in all senses of the term. And as to how, in the very dispute when Mr. Wadia wrote a letter to SEBI, he was told that, well, we won't consider your letter unless it comes through the board. Right? An independent director cannot even individually write directly to the SEBI and expect that there will be some consideration and respect given to that communication. So I think there is a lot of change that needs to come about before we actually mandate regulations. But all points very well taken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This
Thank you.
has been a very, very fruitful discussion. I think there are many more points, finer points, but time always is not on our side. So I am so very thankful to each one of you. Mr. Sharma, I know how busy you are, but you have managed to pull time out of your schedule at the fag end of the day, which is not very easy. Same goes to my venerable friend, guide and philosopher, Mr. Ajay Nanavati. He has just been so generous. So generous. I don't know how I can thank you for acceding always so very gracefully to our request to participate in our deliberations. Thank you so very much. And of course, the same goes to Mr. Samir Kumar, who's also a part of our advisory council. And as I said, somebody who is so very deeply involved in issues which will be discussed, debated, and he is all for improving the governance process. So thank you so very much, Mr. Samir Kumar. And of course,
as an alumnus, I don't need thanks.
Okay. I accept that. And of course, Professor Anil, Suraj, for always being there, involved in. Yeah, these are very significant matters, and if we do not deliberate and give our thoughts and analysis, we are failing in our duty as scholars and researchers in this area. And my sincere thanks also to Madam Greta Varghese for this excellent organization, and also to Mr. Ravishankar Pandey, who can you show yourself up? Ravi, can we see you?
I'm here, sir.
If you speak, then you have to see. We have to see you. Speak again.
Yeah, I'm here, sir.
There.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Ravishankar Pandey has recently defended his doctoral thesis. He's our doctoral student, and he was so very kind to take on the responsibility of being a rapporteur for this discussion. So I thank him very much for taking on that role. And of course, to Mr. Abel. Mr. Abel is our engineer who has been doing the online facilitation today. Thank you very much, Mr. Abel. Thank you, sir. And
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I learned a lot from Mr. Sharma and Mr. Nanavati. Thanks a lot.
No, I learned a lot from all of you. I think. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.